listed, and it might feel like it's a whole new different thing that you have to get into to learn, and like a whole new ecosystem. But I want to show that it's not quite that much. It's not quite that heavy. It's not quite that big of a lift to introduce it into your like toolkit, your knowledge base. Okay. And I hope by the end of this, you can take what we've done here, maybe build something more, and feel good about listing it on your resume and being able to talk about some basic interview questions if you were asked them. So I'll post this link one more time. Go ahead, open up this link. It's our introduction to TypeScript with React. So TypeScript on its own is a it's called a superset of JavaScript. So it's JavaScript with some things added onto it. So at the end of the day, your knowledge in JavaScript is everything that you need to learn TypeScript. We're going to do just TypeScript on its own at first, and then we'll see TypeScript within a React application. So I want you to see TypeScript on its own before we introduce it into React, but we'll see both. We'll see both. And you can build anything with TypeScript. It doesn't have to be React, but it's very common these days that if you're writing React, probably using TypeScript. Okay, so what is TypeScript? At the end of the day, there's something called type, a typed language, hence the name TypeScript. So a typed language that you know a typed language. If you know JavaScript, you know a typed language. It is typed. However, it is something called dynamically typed. So in JavaScript, we can do things like this. Declare a variable called user and give it a name, Alex. Great. Okay, that's great. And all of a sudden, we could have code that says, well, now user is assigned to 10. And that might seem strange because it is strange, right? Like why would we have assigned it to a string of Alex and then somewhere else assigned it to 10? Like that's probably pretty confusing. So TypeScript aims to kind of give some rigidity to our types being strings, objects, numbers, booleans, those things. It says if you start with a certain type, you can't change it. You have to end with that type too. You can't just mess around with our types in TypeScript. So if we were to do this in TypeScript, we would get an error and it would say, hey, type number is not assignable to type string. So it's saying, hey, user started out as a string and you're trying to make it a number. Like, no. No thanks, can't do that. So once you start a variable or start something as a certain type, it can only always be that type. Okay. I mentioned like JavaScript is dynamically typed. So what TypeScript is static type. Static meaning it stays still. It doesn't move. So if it begins as a string, it stays as a string. TypeScript is statically typed. Okay, there's some other rules that TypeScript might introduce into our code. Like if we look at a function, in JavaScript, we would say, here's a function. It takes in a number, it's called add5. It takes in a number and it returns that number plus 5. Great, okay. And in JavaScript, you could do something like this. You could pass in a string of 5 and it would add it together, it would concatenate it, and it would be kind of a mess, right? So TypeScript says, with parameters too, not just variables, but parameters within functions, it says, hey, I want to know what kind of things you pass into here, because I want to make sure that someone else passes in the right kind of data to this function. So in TypeScript, we could say something like add5 the parameter that we pass in called num is always going to be a number. And so this restricts what can be passed in to this function now. I would not be able to do something like this. If I wrote this function with TypeScript like this, with the syntax, then if I tried to invoke that function with a string, it would give me this error. It would say, hey, argument type of string is not assignable to parameter type of number. Okay, so this is saying, you said you'd pass in a number, but you gave me a string. No, thank you. I'm not gonna, this is not the correct code. So TypeScript is full of these kinds of errors that say, hey, you started out with this type, or you said I was gonna get this type, but you're giving me something else. And so at the end of the day, TypeScript is really all about a development tool for us. It's not going to make our code like more efficient. It's not really going to change the user experience. They won't know that it's TypeScript versus JavaScript. Just like they don't know if you use a keyword function or an arrow function, they don't know that. But it's really making our lives easier as developers. Now, it's not going to be easy right away, right? Because you're learning new syntax and all the new types and getting used to new errors, right? Like this error, you've never seen this kind of error before with JavaScript. It's a special error for TypeScript. And so learning TypeScript is all about learning some new syntax. And then a big part of it is actually getting used to the new set of errors that it's telling you. Okay. All right. Questions or thoughts that you have so far? Seeing this. I don't expect you to know the syntax yet, but what questions do you have about the overview of what TypeScript is offering? I'm not going to call on anyone, don't worry. Any thoughts? Okay. All right, sounds good. Well, let's kind of get into it. So there's a REPL. You scroll down to this TypeScript workshop. If you joined later than I sent out the link, I'll send it in the chat again. So here's that lesson that we're working through. Scroll down to this TypeScript workshop section. And let's open up this REPL. Go ahead, open it up and fork it so that you have access to it. But you should see something like this. Okay. I'll give you a minute to just make sure you have it open and fork it. Make sure that you can type in it. Okay. Is anyone having trouble opening this up? I'm happy to take another minute. Anyone need more time? Raise your digital Zoom hand. I can't see everyone. If you need more time. Okay, sounds good. All right, so I want to talk about this first section, part one up here. If we were to declare some variables, we could do it with this new syntax here. So when declaring a variable with TypeScript, this is what you can do. Oh, I'm saying can because we'll talk about why you don't have to later, but this is how we can declare some types. So this is the same. Declare your variable, var letter const, doesn't matter with TypeScript. No difference there. Then the colon says, all right, I'm going to declare a type. My favorite number is going to always be a number. So this is the TypeScript part. This is the only difference with TypeScript here for variable declaration. Colon and then the type. And then assign it a value. In this case, 12. Any number, right? If you try to do hello, it says, hey, whoa, type string is not assignable to type number. Okay, back off. So it's very strict, and that's good. So we can only assign it a number. And again, we can't say now, okay, my favorite number is true. We can't do that. Can't just willy-nilly change types. Those cannot assign my favorite number because, well, yeah, it's a constant. Okay, if we changed it to let, then it's saying type Boolean is not assignable to type number. So again, these are the new errors that you're going to start seeing with TypeScript. So it's saying, hey, my favorite number has a type of number. You can't just go assign it to a Boolean. Okay, all right. So that's how you could declare a variable with that's a type number. Here's type string, uses the string word like you might expect. This one's a little different. Okay, now we have an array. How do you specify an array? Well, we don't say array. Someone decided that that's not a great way to do this. So you say it's an array. But then you need to say what kind of array. So TypeScript wants you to have arrays with consistent types within. So we can't, or we shouldn't, do things like, well, sometimes it's a number, sometimes it's a string. Like, no, they need to be all numbers. And you need to specify that. So you'd say, I have a number array, a number array. So that's what this is saying. Here's my variable nums. It's a type that is a number array, an array full of numbers. And then here's my value. This array with only number types in it. I can't say true here. It would give me the error, hey, type Boolean is not assignable to type number. Saying, hey, you said this array is full of numbers, but now you're putting a Boolean in here. I don't like that. Questions so far on what we've seen? String, number type, array types. Okay. The next one is the most cumbersome, I guess you could say. An object. How do we declare an object? It's kind of similar to array in that we can't just say it's an array. We have to say that it's an object. And we have to say the shape of it. So what I mean by the shape of the object is, what are the properties? So that's the first thing. What are the properties that are in this object? And then for each property, what is the values type? So in this case, if we look at the actual object literal here, we have a distance property, has a value of 5, elevation gain 1200, type loop. Okay, this describes a hike. So TypeScript wants to know, okay, this object literal should always have a distance property and its type is number. Elevation gain property, type number, and a type property, which has a type of string. So this describes the shape of the object literal that we're trying to create. And if we hover over hike, the variable, it displays the shape of that object. So it knows, because we've declared it, that this object has a distance property, which has a type of number, elevation gain property, a type of number, and a type property with a type of string. And again, if we want to like deviate from that, say it's a favorite, true, then TypeScript is going to have a problem with that. It's a big error. But essentially, this error is saying, you never told me about the favorite property. I'm kind of surprised by that. And for the property that you didn't tell me about, I don't know its type. So that's no surprise. So if we wanted to add this in, then we could give it, say like, hey, the favorite should have a favorite property and its type is a Boolean. Okay. All right. So questions about this, about object types? Questions. Yes, Evan, thank you.
I suppose this also qualifies for the last section that you asked if there were questions on.
Great.
So is it common and like good etiquette to declare the types for consts? Because like you can't redeclare a const. So is that normal to do?
Well, we'll kind of get there, but even if it's let, we could do the same thing. So yeah, we will talk about that. It's a great question. Like it's somewhat of a moot point, right? Although with arrays, you could kind of change how an array is structured or an object is structured even with const. But yeah, for strings and numbers, we couldn't really reassign them. But with arrays and objects, it can be especially important to have the type declared. But we'll see in a bit how this actually changes a little bit, but still good to know this syntax. Yeah, great question. Thanks, Evan. Yes, Trisha, we will get to interfaces. Okay. I want you to practice this syntax a little bit on your own. Make some variables of different types. Just try it out. See if it gives you some errors that you have to work through. But make some strings, make some Booleans, make a couple objects, make an array, like just make an array of a different type than number. So just try some new variables out. Give you a few minutes to do that. And we'll get to interfaces in a bit. We'll take like two more minutes. Just want you to see some variables, their types. 2 more minutes. Okay. Any questions, thoughts that you had while trying to create some variables here? Yeah.
So I made an array of strings just by using the same idea as line 7 for you.
Yeah.
But then I put in the number 2 and no error popped up for me.
Rude. String array. Let's try it. So 2 and then 2. Do you not see the red squiggly under the 2?
No, not for me.
I've also had REPL kind of glitch a little bit, and it sometimes doesn't show the hover. And so I would just copy what you have, copy it, like Command A, copy it all, and then refresh in case it doesn't save it.
Yeah. Okay.
But sometimes a refresh of REPL will get the checker running. Yeah.
Okay.
But you should see it. Like if it looks like this, if it's structured like this, then you should see that type warning saying, hey, type number is not assignable to type string. Can't put a number where you said there'd be strings. Yeah. But yeah, thanks for asking.
Okay.
Good reminder that the REPL is a little glitchy with this sometimes. Other questions? Yeah, Parveen.
Hi, I was just wondering, you said it's all static, right?
Right.
And just I know it's a stupid question, but I was thinking, how is gonna help me to catch the errors in my code?
Yeah.
TypeScript.
So
Thank
yeah,
you.
great question. So this is going to prevent things like, let's say you were iterating over this array, my strings, let's see, what would we do with strings? Map them. I have my string, and I want to take the string and say, is a great string. Wow, that string's a great string. Okay. So it's not really that interesting for this example here. What can we do with strings? Okay. Here. Okay. 2 uppercase. I'm going to 2 uppercase this. The string. This line 18 says, all right, strings array, map over it, for each string, uppercase it, and put it in this sentence. That better be a string, right? Does 2 uppercase work on a number? I don't think so. Like 2 uppercase is a string prototype. It only works on strings. So we better make sure that this array is only full of strings. If we get a number in here, like 2, it's going to say, I don't know how to do 2 uppercase on a number. So by using TypeScript to say, this array always has strings in it, we can safely assume that 2 uppercase is always going to work on this variable.
Robbie,
We're never going to get 5. We're never going to get true. We're never going to get some random object. We can be certain, we can feel very confident that it will always be a string, because we've said that this array only has strings. And so something like this, TypeScript is going to say, hey, you didn't put a string in here. I expected this array to be full of strings. And so it would have to be some string to be valid TypeScript, I guess, I would say. It's a great question. Thank you, Parveen. So like I said, it's a, yeah, go ahead. Go ahead,
A
Trish.
follow-up question to that on line 18, actually right where your cursor is on string, would you ever define a type after that? Like my string is going to be of type string.
Yes. So return values, right? Are you talking about return values potentially?
Maybe it's so like, let's say you said you called string something else.
Sorry. New strings. Very good at naming. Okay.
And then right after the map where you're defining string, like maybe let's say, yeah, right there.
Yeah.
If you were to call that something else,
Yes.
that right there, would you say these are each going to be a string?
Yes, that's a great question, because that kind of brings us to our next point. You would think like, oh, TypeScript wants to know all the types. So I have to say like, okay, this is a string. And then like this is a new array of strings, right? Okay, but TypeScript is smart in a way in that it can do something called infer. It can infer types for what we create. So all of this syntax here for declaring variables, you usually don't see. So if you're writing TypeScript, usually you'll just see this. Because TypeScript will look at this declaration and say, all right, you assigned it a number. I'm going to remember that that variable should always be a number then. And so it will automatically infer that my favorite number always has the type of number. If it were a string for some reason, then it would infer that my favorite number is now always going to be a string. So you don't have to declare it. And oftentimes you don't see the declaration of the type. You'll see this. This is valid TypeScript. We didn't declare it, but TypeScript is able to infer the type from the variable declaration. So actually, I want you to see the syntax, but because you'll kind of use the syntax elsewhere, but for variable declarations, you usually don't see this. I could take this all out. And we would still be writing valid TypeScript because of this inference, the ability for TypeScript to infer the type. So now if I hover over hike, it still has the shape of that object that describes height. It says, hey, distance is a number, elevation gain is a number, type is a string, favorite is a Boolean. It was able to like read what you assigned to it and say, here's the shape of a hike. So you don't have to do that. So that is also applicable because it knows if you map over my strings, it says, okay, let me look at my strings. What is my strings? Oh, it's a string array. It's always going to be an array of strings. So if it's always an array of strings, it knows that string is always a string. It's inferring this. It knows how JavaScript works. And so if it knows that string is always a string, it knows that two uppercase works on that string. And it knows if we hover over new strings, it also can figure out that this will always result in a new array of strings. So it has inferred the type for new strings. Now, we can't just say new strings to fixed. To fixed is a method for numbers. Right? What's another method for a number? I'm blanking. Help me out.
Floor.
Yeah, floor. Thank you. Great. So like it knows, hey, new strings is an array of strings. So you can't just do floor. Like we can't, there's no floor property on an array of strings. We can't do that. So this is really, it's able to infer, it's able to figure out what the types of things are. You still can't change types randomly because it infers it. It's just figuring it out on its own. We don't have to be so explicit with typing with variables. Yeah. And likewise, like if we said, hey, what the first index of that, we can't say floor here. I don't think we could, but it's saying we might be able to. Maybe it'll convert it. I don't know. I'd have to check. So inference is a big part of TypeScript. With variable declaration, you'll pretty rarely see the explicit typing. Because of TypeScript's ability to infer the type. Okay, questions? Okay, all right, let's take a pause. Let's take a break. It's like an ordinary lesson. It's 39 after, let's come back at 47 after. See you at 47 after. Okay, let's start coming back together. Did anything come up during the break for anyone? I'm just wondering about this, curious about this. Yeah, Shane, go for it.
I think I found a good resource for questions about types and interfaces.
Oh yeah.
I've used TypeScript before.
Yeah.
I honestly didn't have a good grasp of them. I started reading through this, helped a little bit, so that might help others.
Cool, awesome. Yeah, we'll talk about, we're mainly just going to use interfaces here, but we will talk about interfaces coming up shortly. Awesome, thanks, Shane. Anyone else? Yes.
Yeah, I have, are there hashes in TypeScript?
Hashes. Oh, coming from the Ruby world.
Yes.
Yeah, so there are, let's look up the types. So TypeScript types. There are more types available than basic JavaScript has. So they have like your everyday types: strings, numbers, booleans, arrays. There's the any type, which we might touch on. There's functions, so things can have a type of a function. You can say like, hey, this variable holds onto a function. Object types. So the object type is probably going to be the most similar to a hash in Ruby, if I remember correctly. There's something called union types. Just kind of think about it like an OR operator. There's the type of type and interfaces. We'll talk about that soon. And then, let me see if it, literal types, null and undefined, enums. So in Ruby, you have enumerators, right? So you have enums in TypeScript, which you don't have in just JavaScript. Let's see, and then there's like advanced types. So even some other types that you probably don't use very often in TypeScript. But there's lots of, the point is there's a lot of other types that just base JavaScript doesn't have, but TypeScript does. It gives some extra features in that sense. But in terms of like hashes and Ruby, I think the most similar will probably just be an object. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, it looked like on line 9, I looked like a hash.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think it's very similar. I want to say it's the same, but there's probably some subtle differences between Ruby hashes and JavaScript or TypeScript objects that I just don't know about. Okay. All right. The next section. Talk about inferring things again. We have this people array. It's an array of objects. Notice I don't have to say like, hey, this is an array of people, like an object array kind of thing. I don't have to say that. TypeScript knows if I hover over people, I can do it. Come on, Ripple. Well, of course, it's not doing it for me now, but it is able to infer that this array is full of objects that have a name, an age, and occupation. So it says people is a variable. It is always an array, and that array always has objects with name, ages, and occupations. Okay. So if we look at this code here, TypeScript is only shouting at us about one thing. And it's this parameter. Okay. So it says, if you're going to define a function, I need to know what kind of things you take into this function. For parameters, we do have to be explicit about types. So if we have parameters for functions, it can't infer it. It doesn't know what you're going to pass in. It could probably take a guess, but it doesn't want to guess here. It needs you to be explicit about function parameters. So how we could do something like, okay, it's like an object and it has a name and that's a string and an age and that's a number and then occupation and that's a spell occupation and that's a string. Like we could kind of do something like that, but that's going to be kind of annoying if this object gets really big. So in comes this thing called interfaces or types. So we want to how should I explain this? We want to create something that describes the objects in the array. To simplify how we type the parameter. So we're going to create an interface. Now there is this other thing called type, and there are some slight differences between the two. For the sake of this session, we're just going to use interfaces. Like the difference doesn't matter for this session. So the keyword interface, we can then describe something like a person. And that person has a name. That's always a string. Has an age. It's always a number. And an occupation. That is always a string. So this thing called an interface, we can make any interface we want. I decided to call it person, but guess what? Could call it pants. Okay. Doesn't have to be anything particular. Just describe what it is though. Make it useful. Okay. All right, so this is a person. And now we can say occupation is a string. It's always going to be a string. It takes in a string. Let's see. Occupation takes in a string. Why is it? It's not loving that. But now we could say that people is a person array. Like we could describe this array now. It doesn't help with this squiggly line. Like it wants us to type to make the parameter a particular type. And I think I'm doing it right, but let me know if I'm not, if you have experience with this. But I think this should be typing it. We should be saying like, hey, it's a string. I'm passing in a string. I always pass in a string here. But it's still giving me the red squiggly. So I don't know. Let's Google it. TypeScript, function, parameter, type. Let's make sure we have our syntax right. More on functions. Function handbook. Oh, I have to do it. Yeah, okay. That's how I'm doing it. All right. Geez, REPL. But good to check ourselves with documentation. Okay, it's gone. All right. So we didn't have to make this interface, but I wanted to show you the interface because we need to do it here. So I want you to do it now. So in this example here, custom types, we have a function that takes in a person object and creates a greeting. It wants to know, like, hey, you made this function, but what are you passing into me? What is person? Okay. So I want to pass in this object. So I want you to create an interface for the Alan object to describe the type passed in to greet person. Okay, so go ahead, work on that. Make a new interface that describes this Alan object. So then we can declare what type this parameter is. So right now it's a squiggly line. It's saying, hey, you have an any type. That means it could be any type, and that's not very useful with TypeScript. So create an interface, a new interface that describes this object and make it so that this squiggly line goes away. Give you a couple minutes. I scrolled up a little so you could see our previous interface if you're looking for a hint on the syntax there. I think interface and type syntax was the most like the thing I had to look back at the most. Say, like, how do you structure this? What? How? What? Take about 1 more minute. We'll talk about it. Okay. All right. I've already made a person type, and we can't have, it's kind of like you shouldn't have two variables of the same name, right? We can't have interfaces or types of the same name. So I'll make a new type or interface. Interface, I'll call it human. And anyone want to like walk me through this? Tell me what you had. Yeah, Sam.
I'll take a stab at it.
Great.
So I did name as a string.
Yeah.
And then pets as a string, and then bracket for array.
Yeah, awesome.
And then hobbies as a string, then bracket for an array.
Boom.
And then I'm not sure if you have to do this, but like Alan, do you have to put colon human there?
You don't have to.
Okay.
It will infer it.
That was my question.
It actually, so yeah, a good question, because right now if I hover over this, it says, here's an object literal. It has name, pets, and hobbies, and it matches the interface. However, if we put human here and we hover over Alan, now it says it's a human type. So it is slightly different.
Gotcha.
It does have the same shape, but now it's like, oh, Alan is a human type. And so you might want to do that in this case if there's some special features of this interface, or yeah. Okay, great. And then what?
And then on line 69 next to person, I did colon capital. Oh, sorry, I used a different.
Yeah. Awesome. That's it. So now we said, hey, this function greet person takes in a person, and that person parameter is always of a human type. So this person always has a name, pets, and hobbies. And so now if I take out that dot name and I say dot, it knows person always has hobbies, always has a name, and it always has pets, because it knows the shape of that thing. That's pretty neat. So TypeScript is also really great in development because there's like really good autocomplete functionality that you get with TypeScript, because it knows exactly what you're working with, and it can predict like, hey, you have a person object? Okay, it has these properties. Boom. And it's you can be confident that when you say dot name, that property is going to be there, because we're always working with this particularly shaped object. And that's it. That's like, this is TypeScript, y'all. Like, I'm not saving like the hard part. This is TypeScript. So it's all JavaScript with some added syntax to be very specific about the types that we're working with. Okay. Okay. Yeah. And right, like Shane is saying, okay, person.name, now it knows that name is a string. And so if I put a dot here, it says, all right, here's all your string methods. These are only methods that work on strings. It's not going to give me to fixed. That is not a method for a string. So it's very useful in the development process. Very helpful. Cool. All right, questions about interfaces? Yeah, Evan,
This is just another like etiquette question, I suppose.
go for it. Go
So
for it.
because we saw up above how like declaring what an object's going to look like can get kind of clunky if you're doing it in the object declaration.
Right.
Like, is it just better etiquette to do an interface even if you're only going to make one object with that specific format? Because I guess just to my
Hard
eyes,
to
like
say.
it seems cleaner, you know?
Yeah. I suppose it's hard to say without seeing the specific use case. Usually, if you're declaring an interface, you're probably going to like reuse it throughout your code. And so think of it as like drying up our code in a way. Like you declare your interface once and you can share it throughout your code base. Whereas if you were to declare it right on, like right here, like name, I don't know if you could do this. Like this. Age, number, occupation, string. Okay, this satisfies it, right? I've described it. It's an array. It's always an array of these objects. You can do that. But if you're going to have this anywhere else in your code, you're probably going to have to rewrite this, and that's a pain. So usually you will see an interface being used to describe an object. Unless you really just have a one-off, that's pretty succinct. Yeah. Yeah, good question. Thanks, Evan. Jason.
It's not on interfaces, but so if you're going to cover this, you can just postpone my question. But I was wondering about the type null and how you would go about using that one.
Sure, you can have you can use type null. It's you'll probably won't use it by itself. So let's say you have user ID and it starts out as null. Okay, so let me copy this down here so we're in a blank space.
I was thinking more in the lines of like if you have a user logged in or not. So
right,
you have like a user object that comes in.
So let's change that. Like, so once they log in, their ID, their user ID should be filled in, should get a value. So if we assign it to null, just like this, then it's going to say, of course, the hover's not working, but it's going to say user ID is of type null. And then we cannot say now it's 5. Refresh. Waiting. Come on, Rebel. You could do it. I just not wait for it. So, okay, fine. Okay. Hey, it's saying cannot assign user ID because it is a constant. Okay, well, okay, let's, of course, make it let. And then it'll save and think about it a little longer. And hopefully we'll get a squiggly line again to see that error. Oh, it's actually saying it's an any type. Okay, so if you assign null to it, it gives it a default of an any type, and that goes against the spirit of TypeScript. So you could say it's either a number or null. So this is called a union. A union, think of it as an or operator. It could be a number or it could be null. I'm happy with either. And so now we could say user ID is 5, but we should not be able to say user ID is string. So you can certainly have null as an initial value. You'll probably end up using this union type to set that up. Yeah. Does that make sense, Jason? Okay. Sounds good. All right. And the documentation has whole sections about the null type. Okay. All right. Let's take a break. And when we come back, we'll look at a React app. So let's come back at, let's see, 21 after. And we'll take a look at React. See you soon. Okay, let's bring it on back. Okay. Next, we'll take what we saw here. This is just TypeScript, no React or anything. Now we're going to bring what we saw and learned into a React app. So I made like a tiny React app that you can use and play around with. But go ahead, open up this repo. I'll put the link in the chat too. Go ahead, open up the repo and fork it so that if you want to push up your changes, you can do that. So go ahead and fork it and clone it down. So fork the repo, clone it down. Okay. Once you have it cloned down, change into that directory and run npm install, just like always, and then npm start. And I'll show you what you should see once you have it started. This is what you should see. If you're like, oh, where's the CSS? It's not showing up for me. This is it. Don't worry. That's what it should look like. Give you a minute to get this up and running. Okay. Anyone need more time? Okay. Thank you, Shane. It is very clean. It's minimalist. Yeah. Okay. All right. So if you click the Quiz Me button, it brings up a question. Doctor Who star David Tennant performed in a rendition of which Shakespeare play? I don't know. I'm gonna guess Othello. -1. That means it was wrong. Darn. Okay. And then you have to click Quiz Me again to get a new question. I would guess 1904. That is correct. Okay. Quiz Me. I have no idea. Okay. So that's the app. Trivia game. Make a guess. It updates your score. All right. Go ahead, open up the code base. In your favorite code editor. Okay. And one thing to note, first of all, normally with React, you have .jsx files, JavaScript extension. Now we're using TypeScript in this app. So instead of JSX, it's TSX, TypeScript extension. Okay, so minor difference there. If you see this this file type. Okay, if we go to the app file, the app component, it pretty much looks like a regular old React component with hooks. Okay. I want you to take a few minutes to like take a tour of this app on your own, take a look through the code, see how data is flowing, see how things are working, kind of take a mental note of like, oh, that looks different. Maybe that's TypeScript. Yeah. So take a few minutes to just get a sense of how this app is structured, because we're going to add a bit of, we're going to like change a bit of the component structure. And I want you to see like how the data is flowing as it is right now. So go ahead, take, 5 minutes to peruse the files, follow the flow of data. Okay. Anyone have any questions about what they saw in terms of like how the app is working, or we'll have time to talk about TypeScript specifically, but any questions about how the data is flowing, how the app is working? Happy to talk about that.
So it looks like when you're using use state, there's a special syntax
Yes.
for using type.
Yes. So yeah, great question. That is something that, thank you, Alec. That is something that is not special to React, but it is something that you might, if you're only doing TypeScript and React, like you might not use this outside of React much. So it's not special to React, but you see it in React a lot. So this is saying use state is a function that React created for us to use. Now we saw earlier that functions need to know the type of what's passed into it. So in this case, if we didn't have TypeScript, we would be saying, okay, use state, initial value is 0. But we can't say that. Like this is not valid TypeScript because I'm invoking the function here. I'm not declaring it. And so it's like, I don't, this is, you can't type it like this. So there's something in TypeScript called generics. Where the syntax says you can declare the type that you're passing into this function using this syntax. Saying you didn't make this function, but React is allowing us to pass in a type to say use state, this version of use state will be numbers. And when I use state here, it's not going to be numbers. It's going to be this question interface or null. So a generic says, a generic allows you to specify a type for a function that you're not declaring, that you're not defining. So if you were to look at TypeScript generics, this is what we're talking about here. So I'll post this in the chat if you want to refer to that later. But yeah, it's something that you'll see with use state for sure. Thanks, Alec. Did that kind of clear it up a little bit, or at least point you in a direction? Okay. All right. This is also one where I always have to look up like where did like what carrots, what type, how? Okay, so. All right. Any other questions about the app? Okay. Beforehand, Evan was saying like, why not just like do the object literal and specify the type with kind of the like object literal syntax there? Why use an interface? Here's kind of an example of why an interface is nice. So in this use state hook, we have the question that's coming in from the API. So I know the shape of this question object that's coming in from the API, and I'm going to hold that in this hook. So the question will live here, and I would have to define what that question looks like. The use state needs to know the type. But also, I'm passing the question data over to this component. And if you're using hooks, what are components? What data types are components? They're functions. So if we look at question and answer, then the prop question info, we need to specify the type for that here too. So then I'd have to type it all out again. So sometimes you'll see like a types file. So this types file is where I've defined this interface for question, and you can export it just like you could export a function or an object or whatever. You can export an interface from a file, and this lets us reuse that interface wherever we want to import it in any file. So this is kind of drying up our code. I only have to define the shape of a question object one time. I can define it in this types file and then import it where I need. So in app, I've imported it here. And I've used it on the use state hook here to say, this is a question or it's null. So it starts, I've had it so it starts out as null. And then once the API gets the data, it becomes a question here. Okay. For the score, I'm not using an interface because it's a number. It's nothing really like special or complex. So I don't have an interface for that. I'm just saying it's a number. Maybe if I had a special object that was like how many guesses I took and the score and how many correct questions I got. Okay, that's a more complex object. And then I could make an interface for it if I choose to. Okay, so TypeScript in React, again, it looks like React. It's the same React. It's the same JavaScript, but we have some things that we're adding to it. So like we saw here, if you're using hooks, when you use state, it needs to know, hey, what's the type? What's the type? Another thing that is commonly done and we need to take care of here is props. So with React, we take in props, we pass down props to other components. Here I have this question and answer component, and it has two props, question info and set score. So we need to say, because question and answer is a function, and with, like we saw with other functions, just regular functions, not React, just with regular functions, we had to say, for arguments or parameters, what are the types? We have to do the same thing with React components. React components are functions. So we have this props object. So this is what you would see. This is how you might write it with just JavaScript. You could destructure that props object and get the properties out of it, passing in question info and set score, destructuring, getting those props out. But with TypeScript, it needs to know, what are these? What types are these? It can't infer it. So what you'll commonly see is the props defined as an interface, because sometimes props get kind of long. And again, like it would get too messy to like define the props in here with some object literal like that. It would get it kind of annoying. So a pattern that you'll commonly see with React and TypeScript is an interface that describes the shape of the props coming into this component. So this interface is actually not really shared around for other files. It's pretty much going to be only used in this file. And you'll see like the component and then props. It doesn't have to be that. Again, you could call it anything. You could call it pants. And then it would have the type of pants. But you'll usually see it as the component plus props. So this interface describes the props that are coming in. We have question info, which is a type of question. And we have set score. So this was the hook, the setter for the hook that's coming into this component. This one is more complex, and we don't have time to go over it, but it's essentially saying you could pass in a number or the type is a function. So this syntax is a little more complex and kind of like we don't have time to go over the specifics of this, but if you were to Google TypeScript React props as a hook, you'll see what kind of syntax you could look for. Okay, so this describes the shape of the props, but I need to say, hey, props, you are of this shape. So we could add the type of question and answer props. And so now we have said what the type is of the props coming in. We have essentially set the type for this function's parameter. Okay. Everything else we've already seen. Here I've made a function to evaluate a guess. It takes in an answer, which is a string. That's it. That's the like TypeScript edition here. Everything else is pretty much normal React. Yeah, Trisha.
Could we look at the array shuffle file?
Oh, I've pulled in an NPM package to do this.
Okay, got it. Cool,
Yeah.
thanks.
I know. I didn't want to handwrite some kind of shuffling thing. And so there's an NPM package that shuffles an array in a nice way. And so I just use that. Yeah. You could look at the node module code, I guess, if you want. Yeah. Yeah, what else are you wondering about? That's like, I don't know what that is. Is that TypeScript or is that JavaScript? What's going on here? Yeah, Rachel.
Say you were going to use those same props in a different component.
Yeah.
Would you put that in like its own file, or is that best practice?
Yeah, I think you certainly could. If another
Okay.
component had the same props for some reason, yeah, you could kind of generalize this to be something, and then put it in your types file and then import it as needed, for sure.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, of course. Jason.
Probably a simple question, but what's the difference between TS and .tsx?
Yeah, so types, I've just said as a TypeScript file because I'm not writing any React components in here where I need to kind of like create HTML and insert JavaScript into HTML. So, sorry, did you have familiarity with React coming into
I
this?
do. Okay, so one allows you to write JSX, and the other one doesn't, type thing.
Exactly.
Okay.
That's
Awesome,
it.
thanks.
That's it. It's just like the TypeScript equivalent of JSX. Yeah. Cool. What else? What else? Okay. We don't have a lot of time, but I want you to try something. So there's a task that like I probably wouldn't do it normally, but for the sake of an exercise, make this a component. So right now, make the score display its own component so that you can practice passing in this prop and trying to make the props typed. So go ahead, do that now. Make that its own component. So this H3, make it a new functional component. It takes in the score and displays the score on the page. So no functionality change. We're just moving this into its own component. So then you'll get a little practice. Go ahead, take a few minutes to do that. I don't know if you'll have enough time to finish it, but you'll at least get something started before we talk about it. Take a couple more minutes to keep working on this. Okay, let's talk about it. So what I've done here is just what you would do if we were working in just JavaScript. So I made a component called score. It takes in the score from the hook as a prop called score. And I imported it. And I created a component file called score, and it takes in a prop here. Okay, but red squiggly lines says parameters score any type. And again, usually we want to avoid any types, because if something isn't any type, then we're losing the functionality of TypeScript. So let's make it explicit. Let's explicitly type it. Anyone want to tell me more about what you did or what you tried?
You could make an interface at the top.
We could, yeah. What do you want to call it?
You could call it score props.
Yeah.
And it is an object with score is a number.
Right. So the props object has the score property, and its type is number. Great, okay. Then what? So we've defined the interface. Now what?
And then on line 5,
Yeah.
you need to specify that it is using that with a colon.
Right.
And score props.
Yeah.
That might be too much information because it's just one prop.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah.
Yes, it is kind of overkill, right? So you could get away with that. Something like this, right? Or sorry. Can you score is number? Can you do that? Yeah. So you could do this. That would certainly work for this situation. But you know, your props might be more complex. You might have objects within here. You might have many props. So I just wanted to show for you to get some experience creating an interface as props. But yeah, great. That's it. That's the TypeScript. That's it. So let's run it. Let's make sure it works. Refreshing, quiz me. Okay, I have no idea. Oh, not that one. Okay, so we're getting a score. Seems to be working. Let's check the console for any errors. Nothing. Wow. Okay, great. That's it. That's TypeScript within a React app. So some of the big things we saw are the generics. That's kind of the weird one with TypeScript. I mean, with React, that you'll have to use generics. And since components are functions, we have to specify the type that the parameters are. And you can do that with interfaces. And then, of course, any like functions that you create as like helper functions within your components, you'll have to use TypeScript in there as well. Like, let's see here. In the questions and answer function, I have a function here that takes in an answer and evaluates it to see if it matches the correct answer. And so I had to type that. Okay. But that's it. That's TypeScript within React. You're not going to see anything like super out of the box from here. Right? You've seen like 80% of TypeScript. So yeah, any questions about what we did here with this score component? Okay, all right. Sounds good. Sounds good. Okay, so looking back at the repo, I gave some ideas for like, hey, here's some extensions that you could do. If you want to take this repo and just like add some functionality, here's some ideas. You could do anything you want, I don't care. Go ahead, fork it and make it your own. So you could use this to play around with TypeScript and React some more. I put some like next steps and resources at the bottom of the lesson. So here's some other ideas to continue learning TypeScript. Convert an old project. Create an app from scratch, of course. Look at some open source apps. So if you go on, just Google like open source TypeScript apps and you'll find stuff. So you could look at some patterns. Here's some practice interview questions that I thought of. And like, honestly, ChatGPT is a great resource for saying like, hey, what are some interview questions for TypeScript? But if you're going into an interview and you're like, oh, what are they going to ask me about TypeScript? Here's some example questions that they could conceivably ask you. And then some other resources. There's the TypeScript docs. There's a quick reference. So this is like, hey, here's some quick references to syntax. So like, where's that? How do the brackets? What happens with the interface? Here's like a cheat sheet that they've created. So that's pretty nice. One thing to note is that browsers do not understand TypeScript. So you always need something to take TypeScript and convert it to regular JavaScript. So that's why we use REPL today, because REPL has a transpiler. And if you're doing React, then React, you have to have something in React to take that TypeScript component and convert it into a regular JavaScript component. So if you're starting from scratch, then I put a link to this doc page that says like, just make sure you add this to your create React app command. So that will set everything up so that TypeScript is just ready to go for you. Otherwise, you'll have to add some tooling in, and it does talk about the tooling that you would have to add to convert TypeScript to regular JavaScript, but just keep that in mind. We can't just put TypeScript in any old JavaScript file. We do have to have some tooling to transpile it from TypeScript to JavaScript so that the browser can understand it. Let's see, anything else? I think that's it. So I hope this was like a useful introduction. I think from here you can really like take this and run with it. So go make something. Go look at some documentation, watch some YouTube videos, find out more about TypeScript. But thanks everybody for coming, and we'll put this recording out on there if you want to watch it again.